Good morning, everyone. We are gathered here for today's two-day international conference on cultural crossroads, mapping diaspora, transnational flows, and the fluidity of knowledge. It's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed head of department, Mr. Abdus Samad. He is not just a leader, but also an experience and inspiration to all of us. He has been instrumental in guiding our department towards excellence and success. I welcome Samad Sir for welcome address. Sir, please.
Thank you, Miss Hiba. Good morning, everyone. I'm very delighted to be a part of this international program. The Department of English is organizing a conference on cultural crossroads, mapping diaspora, transnational flows, and the fluidity of knowledge. And the seminar is scheduled on 4th and 5th of this month, today and tomorrow. And we will have eminent scholars from different parts of the to interact on the theme. It's important for us that we have conducted one seminar on transnational relations in 2022, and there were plenty of discussions on transnational issues, especially about the diaspora and fluidity of knowledge. So we decided the department should convene a conference on this topic at a larger scale, and that's why the department has in fact come up with this international conference on cultural crossroads. I'm delighted that we have in our first plenary session we have got Dr. Asha S, who is the Associate Professor and Head, Department of English, Central University of Kerala, to deliver the session. Dr. Asha, welcome to this program.
Thank you so much.
And we have Dr. Mahima Raj, Associate Professor, Central University of Karnataka, to chair this session. Madam, welcome. She's the, okay, all right. Sorry, she's the Assistant Professor at the Central University of Karnataka. No, I hope we will move to the session. And the topic of the first plenary session is the Syrian refugee in literature, disrupting dominant patterns. So, Dr. Asha, I would like to invite Dr. Mahima Raj to chair the session. Madam, please.
Thank you so much, sir. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yes. We have amongst us today Dr. Asha S, Associate Professor from the Central University of Kerala. And it's my honor and privilege to introduce her to the audience. Dr. Asha S is currently working as Associate Professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature, Central University of Kerala, Kasaragod. And she was awarded PhD in 2004 by the University of Kerala on the topic Varda in the Subcontinental Novel in English. She has 14 years of teaching experience at the undergraduate level and 17 at the postgraduate. She undertook 2 UGC minor research projects in 2006 and 2009 on the topics literary representations of the Middle Eastern Muslim women, realities and stereotypes, and Islamist construction. Malayalam periodicals. She has published 23 research papers in peer-reviewed national and international journals and co-authored a book introducing literature currently prescribed for study in the core course of the first year BA English program of the University of Calicut. So this is just a brief introduction, and there's many such accolades in her to her credit, and I welcome her, and I also hand over the plenary session to her to begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahima. Hope you can hear me. Hello, am I audible? Yes, ma'am. Can I share the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Sure, ma'am. You may have to stop presenting from your end, I think. Hope it's audible. Sorry, the slides, are they visible? Can you see the slides?
It's visible and audible, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Mahima. And thank you, Dr. Samad. I should thank Samad in particular because it was his invitation that kind of brought me back to academics because I was too caught up with administration for the last couple of weeks, rather. So special thanks to you and very happy to be part of the PSMO team again, though it's just an online session. So the time allotted to me is 1 hour. So without further ado, I think I can get on to the presentation. What you see here is my presentation in brief. So this is what I would like to do. My focus, as you can already gather from the title, is the Syrian refugee in literature. I've used literature in a rather loose, broad kind of a fashion because I've included different kinds of texts. Like, for example, we have 4 genres primarily. One is documentaries, the other is graphic narratives. I have also brought in a couple of poems, and if time permits, we'll also take a brief look at 2 novels in particular. So that is about the diversity of the genres. And the focus of the discussion would be like this: see how the figure of the refugee, figure of the Syrian refugee in particular, is represented in these texts, literary and cultural texts. What we normally find is that there is a focus on, there's too much of a focus on the suffering, the vulnerability, the passivity of the refugee. These are the experiences of the refugee that dominate in refugee narratives. So I have selected my text in such a fashion that there are both dominant representations as well as those that deviate from the dominant patterns, those that kind of deliberately challenge, invert, subvert, question, problematize the dominant patterns. So, questions like the agency of the refugee, the choice of the refugee, these will remain crucial concerns in our inquiry. How far are the photographs, the images, the voices, the stories of the refugees are represented in these discourses? So I thought I would kind of invert the usual pattern of presentations in academic conferences. Normally, we begin with the theoretical background. I thought let's proceed the other way. So I'll travel you through these books to begin with. And then that would probably introduce you to some of the concerns, some of the patterns, some of the forms of representation, the norms as well as the non-normative of representation discoursing about the refugee. And from that, we'll move on to some of the hegemonic frameworks from which refugee narratives are discussed, and what are some of the possible alternative frameworks suggested by critical refugee studies scholars. So that is by way of introduction. Let's move on to the text per se.
As I've told you, there are 2 documentaries, 3 graphic narratives, 2 poems, and 2 novels. So let's begin with the documentary. Just a minute, let me turn the video on.
Can you hear it?
Yes, ma'am.
كل شيء بسوريا مشتاقة له. يعني للأخ للأخت للعم للخال للجار للشارع لزحمة فرن الخبز يعني للأخ للأخت للعم للخال للجار للشارع لزحمة فرن الخبز. نروح الصبح نشتري الخبز، نروح نشتري الخضرة، صفقة المدارس، روحة الطلاب على المدارس، كل هذا نشتاق له ونحن له. كل شيء بسوريا غالي علينا. كل شيء بسوريا غالي يا ابني.
Excuse me, madam.
إنسان كثير طيب. الجريمة اللي ارتكبها إنه كان يوزع يساعد الناس.
Excuse me, ma'am.
كان ما ياكل هو بالليل وما ينام بالليل بشكل.
We can't see the video.
Yes, can you hear me? Is there a problem?
We can't see the video.
Can you try playing it from your end? Samad, I've shared the links also with you.
Sure, madam.
Meanwhile, I can talk about it a little bit while you get busy with the screening. Can I talk about it so that we will not be wasting time?
Sure, madam.
This is actually a very popular documentary about the Syrian refugee. The title of the documentary is Refugee: Human Stories from the Refugee Crisis. It's done by an American filmmaker, Matthew Furpo. Now, just a minute, let me take you to the next slide. Are you trying to play it or shall I move on?
Madam, can you play that?
Are you playing it?
Sure, madam.
Yeah. Samad, what should I do? Shall I go on talking?
Ma'am, it's better you continue talking. We are not able to see the video.
Okay, so the film is made by Asha S, filmmaker. What you see here is, I wish you could watch at least some scenes of the film, if not the entire film. That's around 10-20 minutes long, I think. It was not my intention to play the entire documentary, but I wish you could watch at least a few scenes of the film. So this is how it goes. You have around some 11 to 12 protagonists in the sense Syrian refugees who are seeking asylum, who are on their a pathway, who are in transit from Syria to the places where they are seeking asylum.
Now, you have watched one scene from it, the first scene probably, where you see one of these protagonists speaking directly to the camera. Okay, so the name of the protagonist, any of the details of the identity of the protagonist, like for example, to what class she belongs, which region of Syria does she hail from. See, none of these details are there in the documentary, in the film per se. So, like that, the film takes us from one interviewee to the next. So, what we are made to listen to is a series of tales of suffering, of hardship, of misery, of vulnerability that these people have been going through, right? And we get to know the identity of the people only at the end of the film, right, where you have the final credits. And it's a very brief kind of a one. It's just 40 seconds long, if I remember right. The final credits, where you have we were given some details of the identity of these refugees who are featured as the protagonists of the film. Then there are also what is called secondary interviewees, that is, other people, children particularly, who figure in the film, but who are not just that they do not have a name, it is also that they are voiceless. They are not given a voice. Okay. But this is one of the very popular documentaries. If you, or at least some of you, would have watched that Netflix film, Born in Syria. Has anybody watched that film, Born in Syria? Those who have watched that film would probably get an idea of how things work in documentary representation. We also have a similar title on Netflix again, Born in Gaza. I think both of them adopt a curiously similar kind of a pattern, right? So what I'm drawing your attention to is to the problematic of documentary representation. Documentaries are rather famed for their documentaries claim to be realistic, right? So there is a certain tag of documentary truth that is associated with that genre. But documentary film theorists themselves have problematized this claim for documentary truth or truth of documentary representation. So there are even theorists like Nichols who argue that documentaries themselves are fictions. And documentary itself, it kind of undercuts its own claim for truth. Okay, so these are some of the problems of representation there. If you could have watched it, you would probably remember that, see, the filmmaker never appears on screen. The filmmaker or the film crew, they never appear on screen. The people who appear on screen are these refugees. So are they the subjects of representation, or are they merely the objects of the discourse? Okay, this is also something that we have to reflect on probably, or look at rather critically. There are also, as you have seen, their dialogues are in Arabic. Now, which particular dialect of Arabic are they using? I don't speak Arabic, I don't know Arabic, but I'm sure many in the audience know. So you could probably see the dialogues that they deliver and the English translations that are given. They are kind of those nuances of the Arabic dialect that the characters are speaking. Now, another problem is with, let me see whether I can also share this slide. If you're not playing the film, probably I can share the slide.
Ma'am, we are trying to play. Please wait a moment.
Yeah. Okay. So will this be an introduction?
What should I do?
I'm trying to share the slide. It's coming up. If this is an introduction, let me know. Okay, Samad, you can intervene any moment. I'll continue with the presentation. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. We are playing the
Okay.
video now.
These are some of the problems of representation in this particular film. Those who are interested, those who would like to do additional reading on this, let me draw your attention to the article that I have cited here. It's from there that I have taken the analysis of the textiles.
هذا نشتاق ونحلله كل شيء في سوريا غالي علينا كل شيء في سوريا غالي يا ابني
I go a little towards Mexico.
Ma'am, are you saying something?
We may not have time to play the entire film, so you can probably move a little towards the middle.
All right, ma'am. Wait a moment. But that again takes more time as we try.
جوزتني وأنا بسجن مشان أرتاح، يعني أنا أطلب الراحة بالموت بس ما أقدر لاقي.
Is this man?
Yeah, this is all right, Sam.
All right.
كثير مختصر.
ما نحن ما هربنا من بلدنا لأن سوريا صفت غابة الحيوانات ما بتقدر تعيش فيها لا كهرباء لا مي لا أمن لا أمان ما بتعرف مين بدك تحارب وجه مين بدنا نوقف ما تعرف قاعد مسكرة حالك الباب مالك سلمان يعني نعاني من نظام ومن داعش يعني ما رضيانين الاثنين ما رضيانين يعني صفت بوقت انه اي منطقه بدك تقعد فيها بدك تكون معه مع الفئه اللي قاعد فيها انت داعش بدك تصير داعشي النظام بدك تصير شبيه تقتل ابن حارتك
الشي اللي يغضبني يعني بسوريا كنت دايما وين ما بروح وين ما بجي بشوف المجروحين بشوف المقتولين بشوف الدم كل يوم بسمع خبر يعني إنه يعني أعز ناسي كلها ماتوا بهاي الحرب يعني ما ضل حدا يعني مثل العادة بالحرب. أنا بعمري صغيرة بس حاسة حالي أكبر من مرة إنه يعني فوق 40-50 سنة من كتر ما شفت هموم
ما بعرف وينه مع سيارته أخذوه مفقود معي ورقة المفقود جايبتها معي والله ما كنت عايشة لا ما كنت عايشة بسوريا خالاتي خوالة لماما أولاد أخوالها لماما كمان ميتين شي قنص شي قذيفة دبابة اللهم صل على شي اللهم صل على اعتقالات تحت في 3 ماتوا تحت التعذيب والبقايا هذول من عائلتها لأمي يعني
Yeah, I think that will do, Saman. Let's stop, otherwise we won't finish.
I think she will do it. Oh, all right. All right. Hello, ma'am.
You can hear me, right?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, so we'll continue with the presentation. So you got some idea of how the characters speak to us in the film, how they kind of look directly, face the camera directly. It's as if they're talking to the viewer directly. It's as if they're inviting the viewers to kind of share their experience or invite the readers into a voyeuristic kind of an engagement with their experiences. Okay. You can take a look at some of these points, which just a minute. Yeah, these I have drawn from the article that I told you about. One particular instance I would like to draw your attention to is the intrusive eye of the camera, right? There is a pregnant woman whose middle section the camera focuses on. Who that pregnant woman is, we are not told. So we'll have to assume that she's one of the women protagonists. Okay. Another interesting thing is that the only character, the only protagonist or interviewee, whose name and a few other details like age and where he hails from, is a governor of a certain province in Greece. Okay, and so naturally, he is the representative of the so-called enlightened West. He's the only one whose name is an identity is revealed to us in the early part of the film, or rather in the film per se. All others are rushed through in that last 40-second final credits. Yeah, so that's all for that. There are a lot of other things. I think I'll have to rush through each of the texts because there are around 9 texts. Shall we move on to the next video? Will it be possible? Meanwhile, while you do it, I can continue with my discussion.
Yes, we will play the next one.
Okay. The next video is, I've already told you, I've juxtaposed the text, chosen the text in such a way that you will get at least one text that reproduces the dominant patterns and another that complicates these patterns. Okay, so the one that you have already listened to is one you've already watched is the one that reproduces many of the dominant patterns, right? The next one is, it's more of a participatory kind of a film where the filmmaker herself is a refugee. She's a 20-year-old Syrian Kurdish refugee who cranks the camera for most part for a major portion of the film. Okay, the filmmaker is the director. I mean, is a Norwegian director. In fact, this woman, her name is Rania Mustafa Ali, and the title of the documentary is "Escape from Syria." So she wanted her journey of escape from Syria to be documented. Okay, so she wanted to do it herself. She felt that the voice of the refugee is missing in many of these narratives of escape, which are told by very often Western intermediaries. So she wanted her story to be told. And she is somebody who had no training in filmmaking, and it was this Norwegian director who gave her a camera, who lent her a camera, and taught her the art of filmmaking. Okay, that is how she gets to play a role in the making of the film. You can just watch the first scene. I think that will do. We don't have time for all of them. So that the film it was published by The Guardian. This film was published by The Guardian in 2017, and it came at a time when media interest, public interest in, I have to not turn my camera on, I'm sorry. Public interest, media interest in refugees was waning. So it's the same kind of story, similar story of suffering and misery and vulnerability. So what is new about it? The media was getting kind of bored with these kinds of routine presentations. It was at that time that The Guardian published this particular film. And not surprisingly, with the publishing of this film, media interest in refugee narratives kind of surged. It surged rather astronomically, we should say. Okay, so you can take a look at the early scenes probably. You can watch the film later. I've already explained it. Just listen to it and see how the filmmaker draws our attention to the very making of the film. So it's a self-reflexive kind of a take. Yeah, you can play it now.
قرر كل إنه فيلم كيوكا شتوس كان مع أوروبا فداعش الفرزابو الخلافة الإسلامية على منهج النبوة فعلا على منهج النبوة أنا. الإسلام ونية ما له علامة بتفجر نصور لك إياه من إنها أول صورة كبير صور لك إياه. السلام عليكم شد كنا حال كيفي ويز لازم باي حسب في كم صباح أنها الكوبانينا لأنه هفالي من نبي تحس كان يدور متلفك أزو هفالي خا من فر هفالي كفتي نرويجة وقرر كل إنه فيلم كيوكا شتوس كان مع أوروبا
Yeah, I think we'll stop there, Sam. Yeah, so that was about the documentaries. It was just to give you a taste of a popular documentary narrative of the refugee crisis, and one where the refugee herself plays a more agential kind of a role. Okay, let's move on to the next genre. I'm sorry about having to rush you through this. The second genre that I've identified and which I thought will appeal to you as students of this digital age, students who are more used to reading visual narratives rather than verbal narratives. We all have a problem. All of us are teachers, many of us are teachers. We all have a problem getting our students to read a 200, 300 page novel, but a graphic novel will definitely appeal to students of our age. So, next, I have put together 3 graphic novels. Just a minute. Can you see it? Is it coming up?
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah. Can you see it now? Are we on the page where we have the front covers of the graphic novels?
No, we are not.
Okay, I have already
documentary representation, politics or ethics. That's what we are watching.
Maybe there is a lag. I'm actually on that slide. Hope you will be able to see it in a minute. Anyway, I'll talk about it. There are 3 narratives. One is Escape from Syria. Escape from Syria is a graphic novel. We still have a lot of problems because these graphic narratives theorists themselves are at a huge disagreement as to whether this has to be considered a genre or a medium. Okay, I'm not getting into the intricacies of that argument, but graphic Novel is more like a genre term used to describe these works of graphic narratives, whether they are fictional or non-fictional. Escape from Syria is actually a fictional work. It was published in 2018. And Samia Kalab, she hails from Iraq. Interestingly, I'm talking about Syrian refugees in literature, but there is only one Syrian writer whom I'm discussing. All others are non-Syrian origin. Okay. Now about Samia Kalab, she hails from Iraq, and she's the one who did the story part of this graphic narrative. She has an illustrator and she has somebody who's helping her with the painting. Okay, normally this is not how graphic narratives are designed. The authors themselves will also be the illustrators of graphic narratives. So this is rather a peculiar case, the one of example of Escape from Syria. The other two narratives both were published in 2018. Can you see that slide now, the front covers of the narratives?
No, ma'am. Yes.
So that is very bad.
Can you refresh it?
Samad, can you play the slides from your end? I think that will be better.
Yeah, let's try.
Yeah, that will be better. So shall I stop my presentation?
Ma'am, will you just stop and try to resume it? Maybe it will work that way. Just try again.
Okay, let me try. I have already stopped my presentation, so I'm trying it again. Okay. Can you see it now? I think it's coming up.
We have got it.
Those are the three titles. Those are the three graphic narratives I'm taking you to. Is it on slide share mode?
We can see the
now it
the front cover.
You can see them, right?
We do.
Yeah, okay. So the other two, The Unwanted and Escaping Wars and Waves, in both the cases, the author himself is the author come illustrator of The Unwanted, Stories of the Syrian Refugees, and Escaping Wars and Waves, the author come illustrator is Olivia Kugler. He was born in Germany and later moved to London. So he's currently based in London. He describes himself as a reportage illustrator. Okay, so that is by way of introduction to the three narratives. Now let me take you to the first one, that is Escape from Syria. Hope we are on the next slide. This, as I've already told you, is a fictitious graphic narrative. I'm deliberately not using the term graphic novel because of this disagreement among scholars as to whether there are graphic novels and graphic non-fiction writings. But this has all the identifiable features of a conventional novel. Like, for example, it has a story, it has characters with a very subtle kind of characterization, that is characterization evolving over the pages of the work. Then you have a sequential narration, that is a narrative sequence of events. So there is a clear setting, so all the identifiable features of a traditional novel you can find in this particular graphic novel. These are the first 2 pages of the graphic novel, Escape from Syria, where you have life in Syria before the revolution. That's what you see on the first page. The 2 pages from the book are juxtaposed onto a single slide here. So on the left-hand side is the first page where we are taken to life in Syria before the revolution. And remember, this is a book meant for children. Okay, this is a book meant for child readers. So you can also categorize it under children's literature. Look at the use of bold colors, loud bold colors, which will appeal to children. On the second page, you have the bomb explosion, and this is what shattered the life of the people in Syria. Okay. Hope you are with me. Your slides are also moving. Are you on the third slide of that book? Can you see that?
We only see the front.
The graffiti, the writing on the wall. Sorry? Can you see that green graffiti that where a boy stands and writes that Arabic inscription on the wall? Otherwise, it would be better to play it from your end, Saman.
It's good now, ma'am. It was fine.
Oh, okay, I had stopped sharing.
Bring it back. Sorry.
I'll move on with, I'll have to do the talking and probably do this. Just a minute. Yeah, so you can see how the detailing works in this graphic narrative. The graffiti is that people want the fall of the regime, that motto of the Arab Spring revolutions. Okay, you know that the Syrian revolution was a takeoff from the Arab Spring revolution, which started in Tunisia and later caught on in Egypt. So you can see the boy turning to the wall, and this is the graffiti, the writing on the wall. That's people want the fall of the regime. Okay. So you can also see the map of Syria here, and with all those regions marked, like Aleppo, and unlike the Arab Spring in the rest of Middle East, in Syria it was not a nationwide kind of a phenomenon. Instead, it was confined to certain pockets of Syria. So you can see here those pockets where the revolution kind of played out. Okay. So situating works. I'm not suggesting that this is a narrative that escapes all the dominant patterns, because you can also see narratives which conform to the dominant pattern. At the same time, you can see moments of disruption. So you cannot probably draw a dichotomy, a neat black and white dichotomy between the so-called stereotypical narratives and the nuanced narratives. Because even within the stereotypical, which conform to the dominant patterns, you can see such moments, such patterns of disruption. Okay. So see how the situating works in this narrative. I'm not going to spend much time on each of these slides. I just want to give you an idea of how these narratives work. Yeah, it's better now. So I'll move on to the next slide. Now, this one, the one on the left-hand side, see, you must have heard about the UNHCR, the United Nations Convention, 1951 Convention on Refugees, which mandates the protection of refugees in the countries where they are seeking asylum. So, but see, in this particular narrative on this page, color draws our attention to the inefficacy of the law in protecting the refugees. Lebanon, for example, where this family first moves on to, Lebanon is not a signatory to this 1951 UN Convention. So Lebanon is not under any obligation to recognize this particular family from Syria as refugees. Okay, hope you are getting my point. So they have this practice of stamping the visa for 6 months, and after 6 months they'll have to get it extended by paying another $200. For a certain point of time, there was this practice of, like, say, when the 6-month period expires, the next 24 hours they'll have to leave Lebanon and then come back again the next day perhaps, so that the visa will be renewed. Okay, so this practice was there for some point of time, and later it was taken away. So now it is like, if the visa is extended for the next 6 months, you will have to pay another $200. Okay, so see the discrepancy between the law as the UN conceives it and how it is practiced, implemented in the countries where they are seeking asylum. Another trend that you can probably pay attention to is the discrepancy between the global north and the global south in their obligation to implement the UN legal measures to protect and safeguard the rights of the refugees. That is, for example, it is a global north that does a major share of, that contributes to a major share of the refugee funding, whereas it is a global south that accommodates large share of the refugee population, right? In the case of Syria, for instance, it is a neighboring countries like Lebanon, okay, like Turkey, like Jordan. They are the ones who serve as host countries to a huge percentage of the refugee population. So there is that discrepancy between the people who contribute and the people who have to share the burden of the refugees. That is also something that you have to pay attention to. And look at the way the tents are portrayed. On the right hand side, it's from another page of the book. See, this is like a picture of the tents from above. We do not know what happens within the tents. We do not know what kind of a life the refugees are made to live in the tents. Why I'm emphasizing this point? Because as we move on to the third graphic narrative, you will see how the picture is very, very different. So I'm not spending time on all the images from the book. See how they go calculating their expenses. This is something like a rough budget that they are drawing up. That's what you can see in pencil drawing there. Remember, all these are meant to appeal to children because it's meant for children of 10 to 17 age group, if I remember right. So I'm moving on. Yeah, you can again see the map of Syria with all those regions that are under the control of different forces, like under the control of the regime, the Syrian regime, under the control of the Free Syrian Army, okay, the rebels who are defected from the Syrian military, the Syrian army. You can see the regions controlled by the ISIS and so on and so forth. So how these graphic narrators make use of maps, of graphs, okay, of pictures, other kind of pictures, even statistics to supplement the verbal narration. Now, on the right-hand side is again another trope in refugee narratives. One is a figure who's a stock figure in refugee narratives. That is a figure of the smuggler, okay, who flees. The smugglers flees the refugees. And look at the life jackets that they are provided with. They are they're fake life jackets. They cost them like anything. These life jackets cost the refugees like anything. And ultimately, it is during their perilous journey that they realize that these life jackets are fake. So these are trop themes, trop figures in refugee narratives. So Samia Kalabs is a book that conforms to the predominant structure of a refugee narrative. Like to say, if we mark it as a trajectory life, it will be something like starting off with persecution, with violence, moving on to the flight of the refugees, and ending up with resettlement in the country where they're taking refuge. So this is a typical pattern of a refugee narrative. Persecution or violence, flight, and then resettlement. Okay, so this is a narrative that conforms to this dominant pattern. I think I'll stop. Look at the previous last one. This is where they have taken asylum in Canada. And this is the East Valley High School where the girl, the main character, the protagonist of this graphic novel, goes to. Okay, so the emphasis is on education, girls' education, how girls are forced to marry at a very early age. So many of those stereotypes about the Orient, especially the Middle East, are reproduced in some of these narratives too. Not that these things are not happening, but where the focus of the narrative falls and what kind of a picture of the refugees the Western reader has in mind. Okay, so I'll stop with that one. This is the next graphic narrative, that is The Unwanted by Don Brown. The first thing that would probably strike you is the contrast in colors from Kalab's narrative. Here you have more muted color palette. By the way, I should also acknowledge here that I owe this part of my presentation to my research scholar, Ms. Khansa. She's working on graphic narratives. I'm very bad at deciphering visual codes, so she was the one who helped me read the visual codes of the graphic narratives. So I acknowledge that. And when I introduced the narrative, the third one, that is Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounters with Syrian Refugees, she literally thanked me. She said, this is like a visual treat for me. Okay, that was by way of digression. This is the second one. Look at the muted color palette. the the sepia, okay, in contrast to the loud, bold colors of Kalab's narrative. Here also maps are made use of, and see how the refugees, in place of those refugee characters, though they are fictional, appearing with very clearly outlined facial features in Kalab's narrative. Here you have the refugees as shadowy, silhouetted kind of figures. Okay, you can also see them as one unvariegated mass of people. And see the paneling. Some of you are familiar with the conventions of graphic narrative, I hope. You have very neat paneling in Kalab's narrative. Here also paneling is kind of adhered to. But in the image on the right-hand side, you see how that is kind of done away with because these people are, it is so large a mass, so big a multitude of people that they cannot be contained in the boxed-in kind of panel. So that is why you have this technique of bleeding. Yeah, again, that stock theme of the refugees escaping their perilous journey in rickety boats. Yeah, here this one refugee who's drowning, this occupies an entire page of the narrative. The color I could not capture, it is like greenish blue of the sea, of the Mediterranean Sea. And look at the exaggerated facial feature of the drowning refugee. Notice that this refugee figure becomes kind of emblematic of all those refugees who have perished in the sea. Yeah. Again,
excuse me, ma'am. I'm afraid if the slides are stuck.
I think it could be, I'll stop this and you can play from your end. That will be better. Because I'm moving the slides and I'm on the right slide.
But the problem is the slides are too heavy. They are not.
Okay. You can play it from your end, otherwise it's fine, Samad. I'll just move on with my narration.
I think it is better you move on with your presentation, and I think the slides.
Okay, I'll do that. This is actually difficult for me. I'll have to do both. I'll move on with the presentation.
Because the slides are too heavy.
I wish you could see at least one page of the last narrative. That is a non-fiction graphic narrative. I would strongly recommend that narrative for you. Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounters with Syrian Refugees. That is by Olivia Kugler. If you take a look at that narrative, what will strike you immediately is how Kugler has done away with the whole idea of what you call paneling. Paneling is almost missing in that graphic narrative. Instead, he uses photographs, huge kind of photographs. Yeah, just a minute. I'll read out how Brown's book, this is how Brown's book ends. At the end of Brown's book, he adds something like a postscript to the book. And this is what he says. I'm talking about the earlier book, The Unwanted. Early on, I decided The Unwanted would focus on the refugee experience and disregard information beyond that constraint, except when necessary for context. I was determined to keep the attention on the refugees, reporting, for example, that a child drowned in the Mediterranean, fleeing horrific violence, and not that the child was Shia, Sunni, Kurd, Christian, or Yazidi. This point is very important. He deliberately kind of presents the Syrian population as undiversified. He does not go into the specificities of the demographics. Like Syria is probably one of the most ethnically diverse regions of the entire Middle East. But Brown chooses not to go into these details. And then this is the explanation he puts forward for that. To fully portray the complex religious, political, and cultural web that describes Syria, that would have made for an enormous, sprawling book. Make a note of the two adjectives. So you would actually require a huge book, a sprawling book, one that would not be well served by a graphic novel. That is, this may not probably suit the conventions of a graphic narrative. It may not look or read good as a graphic narrative if the author chooses to go into the specificities of the Syrian population or the other cultural, regional, religious peculiarities of Syria. But this is entirely belied. Okay, this is entirely belied by the third narrative, that is the one by Kugler. Kugler's is literally a sprawling book, and it is a book that makes demands on the reader. You can remember that Barthes's distinction between readerly and writerly text. It is a book that makes huge demands on the reader. Like see, some of the pictures are fully painted, some are half painted. Some of the drawings he deliberately leaves incomplete, and there is a lot of detailing of the characters. Like, see, in Kalab's narrative, you show how the tents were portrayed. In Kugler's narrative, we are taken directly into the tents. We are like within the tents. Okay, and the tents are not a place, not static kind of places, not lifeless places. The tents are the refugee camps, are places where Syrian life is at its best, rather. Syrian life is at its vividest form, rather. Okay, so that is the feature of this particular narrative, and it departs from that formula of persecution, violence, flight, and then resettlement, because in the different chapters of that narrative, escaping wars and waves, we are taken to the different refugee camps in various places. Like, for example, it begins with the camp in Iraqi Kurdistan, then it takes us to the camp in Greece, the camp in England, the camp in France, the camp in Germany, like that it goes on. Okay? So you don't have that familiar pattern there, that familiar trope there. Instead, it is life within the tents, life within the refugee camps. And you must have, at least some of you would have read that Agamben piece on the refugee camp. So that the idea of the refugee camp as a liminal space, this is something that many of the critical refugee studies scholars have problems with. Okay, so these camps are where we get to know the refugees in different roles. They don't come across to us simply as refugees. We get to know them in other roles, like, for example, one is a carpenter, one is a rock band player. So he teaches rock music to the children in the refugee camp. Okay, they talk about their artistic ambitions. See, they are very much there, their names, their identity, the details of their family background, all these he fills the narratives with. So I strongly recommend that book for you. I have just 3 minutes left, I think. Shall I quickly jump to the conclusion, or can I briefly talk about the poems and the novels? Very briefly. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
3 minutes left, I think. Should I move to the conclusion, or can I just briefly talk about the poems and the novels? Probably 1 minute on that.
May you please brief the session, ma'am?
Sorry?
May you please brief the session, ma'am?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I'll move to the conclusion then. I also wanted to talk to you about Refugee Noir, and one of the novels, Omar Al-Akkad's What Strange Paradise. It is a novel where you have that racy thriller kind of a pattern. You have one refugee boy and a girl of the Greek island where this refugee boy is washed ashore. Those two strike up a friendship, and they are trying to run away from, they are trying to escape being caught by the military guards on the Greek island. So it's not a very encouraging, welcoming kind of a place. It's a very hostile kind of a place. These places where they seek asylum. And this girl, Vanna, is trying to rescue this boy, Amir, from being captured by the military guards. Okay. And this has all the ingredients of a typical thriller, like just as you have in a traditional noir, in a traditional film noir. But this work may be categorized as what is called refugee noir. And Akkad, I would say, even dismantles the pattern of a refugee noir. So, because you read the entire novel, the novel is structured in 30 chapters, and all the 29 chapters of the book are titled like after, before. That is, after Amir makes his escape from Syria and before he makes his escape from, after he reaches the island and before he makes his escape from Syria, and his journey, his perilous journey by a rickety boat. So this is how all the chapters are titled. It is a combination of an alternating combination of after and before. And only the final chapter has a different title, and that title is now. Okay, so it is there that the reader realizes with a shock that the entire novel that we have been reading has been a fantasy. Because Amir had not made his escape, it was Amir's dead body that was washed ashore. So what Akkad is doing there is he takes up that familiar Peter Pan story, children's story, and he inverts that. Okay, he repurposes it so that he frustrates the expectations of a Western reader. Okay, that is again another interesting read. So I'll jump to my conclusion that is about critical refugee studies. Critical refugee studies have a problem with what is called the politics of empathy. Empathy, an empathetic humanitarian framework, is the predominant framework that is used to read and engage with refugee narratives. Because that documentary that you have watched, that is something that inspires emotion in the mind of the viewer. Every one of us who's very humane, who's very humanitarian, will naturally feel empathetic about the situation of the refugee. But there is a certain politics about this empathy. Okay, I would suggest that you read the piece by the Zambian writer Nambali Serpil. She has written an essay titled "The Banality of Emotion." The title of the essay, it is on analogy with Hannah Arendt's piece, The Banality of Evil. Okay, so this is titled The Banality of Emotion. So what is problematic about capitalizing on emotion in refugee narratives? So this is the predominant narrative that is used to read refugee narratives. I'm not saying that this is an inappropriate framework. The critical refugee scholars are not suggesting that. Yes, this does carry its potency, but it's equally important that we move beyond this frame and try alternative frames. Like, for example, the discourse of the beneficiary. If you had listened to that poem by Gayat Almadoun. Gayat Almadoun is the only Syrian writer, the only Syrian poet I'm talking to you today about. His poem is titled Avian. You can watch it later. I've provided the link. Everything is with Samad. Dr. Samad, I'm sorry. He was my colleague and he's like a long-time friend of mine. So I refer to him casually as Samad. I'm sorry, Dr. Samad. So you can probably watch this later, read this poem. Almadoun himself recites that poem, Avian, where he is very critical of the benefits that the Western reader who is a voyeur to the refugees' plight. So those benefits that the Western reader is enjoying, probably he does not play a role in the current plight of the refugees, because in the case of Syria, you also know that the global West has also played a role in vitiating the crisis. So the reader, an ordinary reader may not have been culpable of that, but he is definitely in the position of the beneficiary. So if you have something like an implicated subject, a subject who is critical of his own position, a writer who's critical of his own position, a writer who admits that he enjoys the benefits which the refugees are deprived of, that would probably be a framework that you can use to read and engage with refugee narratives. So one is the benefit of the discourse of the beneficiary, and the second is the implicated subject. So these are some alternative frameworks that you can use to read and understand the refugee situation and critically think about it. So on that note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asha S, for taking us through this multi-generic journey and making us better understand the refugee situation and how that gets represented in literature and across genres again. The title Syrian Refugee in Literature, Disrupting Dominant Patterns, looked at 4 genres specifically, with the demonstrations from 2 documentaries, 3 graphic novels, 2 poems and 2 novels are the texts that couldn't be dealt in detail, but maybe in the discussion session, somebody might ask a question regarding that. And the figure of the Syrian refugee, the focus, and how that has been represented from a Western eye, and what kind of narrative pattern exists, and over the years, and how the problematic, and further, Dr. Asha is also focused on the problematic of documentary representation as well, with the examples of Born in Syria and Born in Gaza as well. And further, she talked about the voice of the refugee being a missing trope in all of these narratives, and how Western intermediaries take a major role or steal the agency in some sense, and with the examples of documentaries and the bigger one of a self-reflexive kind of a documentary that was projected, is a disrupting, is indeed in its attempt itself is disrupting that pattern. And further, Asha S's talk moved on to graphic novels. There were a couple of problems with the slides, and I was not in. I couldn't go through the detailing aspect, as like I could understand the explanation that you gave, but it was difficult for me to comprehend, as I was not able to see the images. But I feel that there is a lot of attempts from the graphic novel genre as well, and largely we can see that throughout the session, Dr. Asha is focused on the problems of representation, the problematic of be it of self-representation, and especially of the representation stemming from other geographies and other cultures, and so on and so forth, within which the larger problem remain the homogenization of Syrian population, which the speaker touched upon, spreading across different genres, and moved on to presenting critical refugee studies and the problem within critical refugee studies, and why should we be incorporating, or why should we be addressing the same predicament or the same human condition from a different point of view, and through which I believe with this presentation, I believe the audience has gained much in understanding the problem of representation, and understanding the set pattern, and how certain narratives are disrupting the set pattern of representation and voicing. And to begin the discussion, the session is open for discussion, and I would appreciate if all of you can, those who are online can post your questions in the chat box, and those who are offline can post questions directly, I guess. To begin the discussion, I would request Dr. Asha S to throw light upon some aspects, like how does the employment of language differ from the Western point of view, and from the non-Western point of view, if I may say so. That's I mean, if you could throw light upon this aspect with regard to the poems and the novels, which you didn't get time to discuss, and is there a narrative I mean, the further next question would be: is there a narrative that you have come across from a Syrian originatory point, but at the same time that incorporates something like a white savior trope? So, have you come across such such narratives? It's just a curiosity I have. And with the second documentary, there was um, a specific dialogue which the character, the person in the documentary, says something like, I put it in quotes: "Laughter is also part of the video now." So, how do you read that dialogue per se, as to even take time to mention that the laughter is also part of the video? So, how is it breaking a dominant pattern or a set pattern? And it's not even deleted. I mean, it shouldn't be. So it's not deleted by the Guardian. So there is a different agency playing a role. At the same time, there is an a refugee who is saying these things and keeping it part of the documentary as well. How would you see such expressions from a critical refugee studies point of view? So after this, I think we can move on to the next questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahima. This is the first time we are meeting. Probably we'll catch up again later. So you had raised three questions, if I've got you right. One was about the language of some of these narratives, especially the poems and the novels. I'll respond. Can I respond to them one by one, like?
Yes, ma'am.
Now I'll talk about that novel. You can probably read Almadoun's Evian. Evian is a poem where the two poems that I had brought up for discussion, I was planning to bring up for discussion, were one, the familiar Syrian refugee narrative, that is Khalid Hosseini's Sea Prayer. That's a poem which every one of you would have read. You might even have watched the 360-degree video done by where he also plays a part. Husseini himself plays a part. See, the emotion, that the dominant mood, the dominant emotion of that poem is sadness. There is also nostalgia about life in Syria before the war, okay, before the revolution. You can see this nostalgia, you can see the sudden change, the sudden shattering of the lives of the people of Syria. This works both through the verbal language and the non-verbal language. Like, for example, in the illustrations, in the pre-war phase, there is a use of vibrant red color. Okay, whereas in the during the phase of the revolution, once the war, the revolution has set in, I would like to use the term revolution rather than the war, because there is a certain productive appropriation of that term of revolution. So there, in the illustrations go like this. There is a very vibrant red color in the early one, and also the lush greenery. Whereas during the later phase, this gives way to dull colors like brown, like gray. Okay, you can see that in the illustration. That is about the visual language. And in the verbal language too, the long lines of this is actually a multimedia kind of a work, because it's written in the form of a letter from a father to his son. It can also be called a story. It can also be categorized as a short story. At the same time, the way the lines are presented to the reader, it can very well be called a poem. Okay, so there is a defying of genres. There is a border crossing there itself, crossing the borders of genres. There is a border crossing there itself. There is a crossing of border generic boundaries. So it can also be read as a poem. If we perceive it, if we conceive it as a poem, we can see that in the early section, that is in the pre-revolution phase of Syria, we have long lines, long sentences, and gradually they are replaced by short staccato kind of sentences, okay, spitting bombs. So this kind of mimics or echoes the sound of the weapons. Okay, So that is one clear example of a change in language. I'll also suggest one more that is from the novel The Wrong End of the Telescope by Rabbi Alamuddin. This is a novel written in English, and some of the chapter titles, like I'll also talk about one convention, though that does not immediately refer to language. That is a writer is there is a writer figure in the novel. There is a refugee figure in the novel. There is a writer figure in the novel who is addressed to in the second person. His name is not revealed to us. So you have chapters like you, the writer. Okay. And this writer is the I've given you the one of the frames that I suggested was that of the implicated subject. So this writer is a one who uses the language of self-deprecation, of implicating himself, right? So I think even in the very choice of the chapter titles, Alamuddin's is a very savage, sarcastic kind of a take, like Almadun's. The poet Almadun, and Almadun is somebody who was doubly displaced. He's not just a Syrian poet. We label him as a Syrian poet today. Actually, he's a man of Palestinian origin. His parents hail from Palestine, and he happened to be born in a refugee camp in Yarmouk, Syria. Okay, so it is like doubly displaced. Anyway, both Almadun and Alamuddin's style, there is a curious pattern of similarity in their style of writing. Okay, that is about by way of response to the language. The second question was about writers from Syria, right? Who and yeah, I'll take you to a piece by Mohija Kaf. Mohija Kaf actually problematizes the very term Syrian literature because many of these writers from Syria are not in a position to write, to narrativize their experiences of refugeedom or refugitude, as Nguyen uses the term. Why? Because these writers are dependent on state funding from state agencies for their livelihood, right? So they are not in a position to narrativize their experiences. In fact, narrativization itself becomes a privilege, an act of privilege, which many of these writers do not enjoy. You have a video by Khalid Husseini where he urges the refugees to pick up their pen and start writing. It is actually a kind of an outrageous demand on many of the refugees because they are not in a position to pick up their pen and start writing. So this applies to many of the Syrian writers. But incidentally, because you have put that question, I'll talk about just for a second about Samar Yazbek. Samar Yazbek is again a writer whom many of you would have read in Arabic. She writes in Arabic, and the books have been translated into English and also into Malayalam. Harita Savitri, for instance, has translated one of her novels, Planet of Clay, into Malayalam. So she is someone who dabbles in different genres like memoirs. Memoirs, by the way, are a very popular form of refugee narratives, which I have not taken into discussion because that would be like venturing into a rather forbidding kind of an area. So that's why I've not brought it up for discussion. So Samar Yazbek is someone who is a proper Syrian writer who, again, inverts this pattern because her book, The Crossing, begins with a movement, but this is a reverse movement. It is not like a Syrian escaping from Syria and moving to the safety, the sanctuary of the West. It is like it is Yazbek who had escaped Syria fearing persecution. She had taken shelter in Paris, in France. So it is a reverse journey, like she's crossing over to Syria from Paris. And the entire book is about the story of three crossings that she has made during 2012, 2013. Okay. Yeah, that again. And what was your last question? I'm sorry, I forgot. Mahima?
In the documentary where
yes, the humor, the laughter, yeah. Because again, see, it is pathos, it is sadness that dominates. Look at the other documentary, right? Laughter is kind of missing there. It is as if, that's why I told you the refugee comes across only as a story. It is as if the refugee does not have other dimensions to his or her experiences. The refugees have a lot of other dimensions to their experiences, but the narratives foreground or rather reduce the experience of the refugee to the figure of the passive, silent, vulnerable refugee, right? So that is why the images are pervaded by, even Husseini's poem is pervaded by a mood of sadness, by a mood of nostalgia, right? This is not what you find in Ali's documentary, right? So, and again, if you see Alamuddin, for instance, again it is savage irony and sarcasm that dominates. He has a very interesting take on that iconic image of the Syrian refugee, that is Alan Kurdi. He builds up a narrative about how Alan Kurdi, he has come to lose one Y in his spelling. Okay, you should read that part of the narrative. It is richly interesting. It is so laugh provoking. The entire book is structured in that fashion. Okay, so they deliberately invert some of those moods that we associate with these narratives. Not just that, they frustrate our expectations about what should come from a refugee narrative. It is sadness, it is grief, it is a tale of suffering that we look forward to in a refugee narrative. So, a 20-year-old refugee doing a film on herself, but starting off with laughter is something that would frustrate the expectations of a viewer or a listener. So, that is deliberately done and that is maintained all through life. Not that there is nothing traumatic about the experience. Everyone does understand the trauma part of the refugee experience, but this overrating of trauma and that being done from your privileged spaces is what is problematic. Somebody had put a question here about, I was also trying to respond to it in the chat. Can you see the shift in the what was it, in the conventions, that in the genres that they deploy? So it is not that all these writers are kind of moving on to a phase where now they start problematizing the early conventions and they start experimenting with new generic forms. You see something like a coexistence of the hegemonic patterns as well as the alternative patterns. I'll give you one example. At the time when, before I happened to read Omar Akkad's book, What Strange Paradise, I came across a narrative titled Escape from Aleppo. That is also a work of children's literature, Escape from Aleppo. And the author of the book, N.H. Senzai, Senzai is an American, but her husband happened to have a connection with the Middle East in Saudi Arabia. So she spent some years of her life in Saudi Arabia. That is all that she has. That is all the experience that she has to speak of the Middle East. Now, in an interview that Senzai gives to one of the readers of the book, a question is put to her, like, this is the escape of a girl from Aleppo. Aleppo is in Syria. And this girl, this is a very pathetic kind of a condition, the typical refugee narrative that you are familiar with. So the question put to the author Sensei is, what kind of a drink you would recommend to the accompaniment of reading this book? That is a very, very outrageous question. And I expected the author to be annoyed at the question. Instead, she played along with the one who put the question. Okay? And she started recommending all those Arabic drinks that one can read, have a sip on while reading the sad story of the refugee. That is a height of absurdity, right? And this is the politics of empathy that those like the one who wrote the banality of empathy, what is Namwali circle. Okay, so the one that these people talk about. Not that empathy is something that is not expected, not that you don't have to empathize with their situation, but this is not how empathy should work. There is a certain politics of empathy, there is a certain ethics behind it. Okay, I hope I have answered the question. Any general theorists like? Is there any other question before that? Can you suggest any contemporary theorists of refugee theory? All those refugee theorists, that all those alternative frameworks that I've referred to, they are not offered by refugee theorists. They are culture studies theorists. Like, for example, the concept of the discourse of the beneficiary. That is a concept put forward by the contemporary culture studies theorist Bruce Robbins. I'll put it in the chat. He has a book by the title The Beneficiary, Bruce Robbins. The title of the book is A Beneficiary. Robbins is not a critical refugee studies theorist. Robbins is a culture studies theorist whom critical studies theorists draw on. And for critical readings on, or for rather like sample pieces of critical refugee studies scholarship, I would recommend the Rutledge Companion to Refugee Studies. Okay, you can take a look at that. And the other one, the notion of the implicated subject, that is by Michael Rothbard. That is also, you will get a book under the title The Implicated Subject. And the one that the Zambian writer whom I refer to, The Banality of Emotion, that is a very short piece by her. She is also a novelist, and she is also someone who inverts this pattern of refugee movement in her own first novel. I'll put the title of the novel too here, The Old Drift. The Old Drift is her maiden, is her debut novel, Namwali Serpil's debut novel. There she inverts the pattern of movement. That is, the novel is about the English, Italian, and Indian people who move into Zambia, not people from Zambia who are moving over to the West. Okay, so she is also somebody who writes about, who can theorize the experience of borders, and the entire novel, if you put it kind of thematically encapsulated, it will be something like the arbitrariness of borders. The novel itself is about that. So you can even categorize her under a refugee studies scholar. So for all the recent takes on refugee studies, you go and read this Rutledge Companion. You can also read many of the Vietnamese authors, Dina Nairi, for instance, where you have the reference to the ungrateful refugee. Look at the very title of the book, The Ungrateful Refugee. Because there is a certain gratitude expected from the refugee for all the benefits and all the protection that they get to enjoy. So why should there be a disproportionate kind of a burden on the refugee to be grateful? Everyone is expected to be grateful. So there is burdensome gratitude is not something that refugees would like to conform to. So Dina Nairi puts it across very clearly in the, you can read that piece. It's a beautiful piece, The Ungrateful Refugee. So hope I have answered some of these questions. I think I have put more in the chat than the participants.
Thank you, ma'am. I invite the audience students, especially if they have any questions.
It need not be questions per se, it can even be like a conversation, because this is an interest I developed very recently. I started reading up on Syrian refugee literature over the last 4 or 5 months. So it's a very recent kind of an interest. If anybody wants to add on to it, I'll also be benefited. So rather than a confrontation.
There's a question in the chat box. As one, it's from Naufal PT. It says, I was wondering if you have taken into account who was the primary audience or receivers of these works of arts. Was it refugees or non-refugees? Is a question.
Yeah, because that is not a question that you can answer in one sentence, probably. Because many of these narratives, as I have been referring to in the course of my discussion, they are meant for even region, apart from region wise, it is even age wise. See, some of them cater to children, some of them are meant to cater to children. They come across as works of children's literature. And look at the kind of narrative. See, I told you about Senzai's book, The Escape from Aleppo. That is a book which is overtly meant for a Western reader, not meant for let alone a refugee, not even meant for a reader from the global south. Okay. Actually, when you look up for refugee narratives, all those titles that strike you, all those titles that Amazon and others, Amazon, Flipkart and others promote, those are the ones that cater to the Western stereotype. So Senzais was the first book that I happened to read. It took me a long time to even come across a name like Omar Al-Akkad. Omar Al-Akkad again is not a Syrian; he's an Egyptian who has now citizenship both in Canada and the US. And we invited him over here to an online conference in our university. So, What Strange Paradise is a novel that I did not get to hear about. It's not a very popular kind of a book. Whereas Escape from Aleppo is a hugely popular book because that is one that plays upon the expectations of the Western reader about the narratives from the Middle East and countries like Syria. So, the best way to identify them is to look at which one tops the promotion list. Okay, because the other ones you rarely get to hear about. You will have to kind of go on exploring so that you'll come upon these writers.
Thank you, ma'am. We have reached the end of this session. If there are no questions, I think we're also running late. So thank you so much for such a lucid presentation, and I am sure this is going to ignite a lot of research interest among the students. And I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahima. Thank you so much, and thank you all.
Hello, ma'am. Hello.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. As we conclude, it's my pleasure and honor to express our sincere gratitude on behalf of our department and the organizing committee. Your insightful paper and the discussions that we had. I wish we had more time so that we could have had more discussion on the topic. And anyway, I'm sure that the speaker, the listeners, and the audience and the researchers must have found insights so that they can pursue further research on that. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the insightful session. And thank you, Dr. Mahima, my friend, again for being with us. It was a wonderful session. Thank you all for joining us.